would like to introduce a new word, a sort of chimeric monster, Metaximodality. Metaximodality means both between modes and the mode of the between. In integral grammatology, this is the conjunction of prepositional and adverbial philosophemes, where prepositional philosophy starts from relations and adverbial from the acknowledgement of a plurality of qualitatively inflected modes of becoming. Yoked together, they're intended to invoke an approach which starts from the thick midst of things, from the withness of our being singular plural, a participatory, integral pluralist approach to the living field of our co-becoming. In much recent philosophy, there's been an interest to recover or return to a greater participatory sensibility, beyond the propositional and critical modes that have dominated modern and postmodern discourse, to challenge the vicious dichotomies of modernity, as Viveros de Castro puts it, and to open up new pathways for thought through transcendental empiricism and speculative realism. For a number of thinkers who've begun to explore this territory, they've found conceptual resources in Neoplatonic tradition, Christian parachoretic theology, or Buddhist philosophy. Others have found thought partners in indigenous wisdom and shamanic traditions, and that's where I'd like to focus in this discussion. David Bohm, for instance, looked to Blackfoot and other Amerindian languages and cosmologies for insight into how to better language and conceptualize the vision of the world that was emerging for him through his work as a quantum physicist. But for exploring the chimeric monster that is metaximodality, I'd like to look to a different thinker, the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveros de Castro. In particular, I'd like to look at the Amazonian cosmology he presents in the first half of his groundbreaking book, Cannibal Metaphysics, the framing concepts of perspectivism and multinaturalism, and then a suite of attendant concepts, insistence, infinite self-difference, intensive superposition, metamorphosis, transparent precosmology, and perspectival commutators. Footnote. Now, some of you might want to stop me right here and ask me just what it is I think I'm doing, explaining my own made-up word with someone else's made-up words. And I get the impatience with neologisms. It's philosophically risky to play fast and loose with new terminology, and it's easy to lose the thread of clarity. But I'll take heart in Brian Swim's reminder in the universe story that any new paradigm that can be explained entirely with existing vocabulary is not likely very new at all. And as more than one commentator has observed, Viveros de Castro's Cannibal Metaphysics and surrounding work has initiated a paradigm shift of its own in anthropology, an ontological turn. There is a strong Deleuzian strain that runs through his presentations, which will be familiar to many, but there's also something unique, something which might feel at once rather alien to common Western assumptions, and refreshing to those who have been pushing into participatory, process-relational, and speculative realist thought. Two framing concepts that Viveros de Castro introduces that have helped usher in this ontological turn are Amerindian perspectivism and multinaturalism. By perspective, what is meant is not a representation or belief. Rather, perspective is always embodied. It's a positioned site of world engagement and world enactment, a point of agency and intentionality, a mode of existence. For the Amazonian groups Viveros de Castro has worked with, and for certain other Amerindian, African, and Malaysian peoples, the world is teeming with perspectival beings, animal, plant, geological, meteorological, and spiritual beings, each embodying its own unique perspectives on the world. This sounds similar to animism, but animism, especially as Western theorists have framed it, takes for granted a substantialist human nature split, and often a substantialist conception of soul or spirit, which various entities may possess. Neither of these assumptions hold in the Amerindian worldview. Rather, for perspectivism, there's an intensive human-non-human difference internal to each being, and the human identity is a pronoun-like positional concept, not an essentialist or substantialist one. To begin to appreciate what's meant by this, we need to bring in Viveros de Castro's second important concept, multinaturalism. Our more familiar notion of multiculturalism presupposes a singular, shared, universal nature, in which subsist multiple different cultures, multiple different ways of representing and relating to the world. But multinaturalism is nearly the inverse of this, a kind of figure ground shift. What all beings share in common is their humanity as a cultural ground state, their ability to inhabit a human-like position in their respective world spaces. Where they differ is in their bodies or forms, and in the specific natures or worlds they inhabit relative to their perspectives and embodied capacities. A jaguar occupies the human position in its world space, and it will see humans not as humans but as prey. It will see blood not as blood but as manioc beer. For other creatures, humans might appear as predators or spirits. There is a reciprocity of perspective here, though not necessarily a mutuality. For Amerindian perspectivism, in other words, nature and culture are not two distinct domains, but rather two aspects of the same reality, which are relative to the perspective of each being. Nature is what is seen from the outside, while culture is what is seen from the inside. Therefore, nature and culture are not fixed and mutually exclusive, but rather variable and interrelated. This means that each kind of being has its own nature and its own culture, which are different from those of others. Each kind of being has its own bodily form and its own point of view, which determine how it sees and is seen by others. Each kind of being also has its own preferences, norms, and language, which determine how it acts and communicates with others. However, this does not mean that there is no common ground among them. All beings share a common humanity, which in Amerindian cosmology is the essence of culture. All beings see themselves as human, and act according to human logic and fundamental human values. The difference is that, interspecifically, they do not see other beings as humans, but rather as animals, plants, spirits, or other kinds of entities. Nouns in this deeply relational, but not relativistic context, take on a pronounal or deictic function. To speak of a fish or a tree is not to name a substance, but to invoke something more like a familial relationship term, nephew, grandmother, where the word names not a fixed or essential identity, but a position one occupies in an intra- or interspecific relational network. In acknowledging a plurality of enacted worlds, then, multinaturalism does not deny the existence of nature, but rather recognizes the diversity and specificity of each embodied perspective. And in positing a perspectival anthropomorphism, it doesn't involve a rejection of the uniqueness of various cultures, but rather extends the concept of humanity to all beings. But in extending the potential status of humanity in this way, we might wonder, does this then lead to a naive anthropocentrism? The Veros de Castro's analysis of the pronounal structure underlying the Amerindian experience is illuminating here. Instead of seeing humanity as possessed of attributes that animals lack, Amerindian thought sees humanity as a point of view. We see ourselves as humans, yes, but so do jaguars and tapirs. This is a radical displacement of the concept of humanity. If all can be humans, then we are not so unique or special. And in fact, the concept of what it means to be human at all undergoes a fundamental change. When everything is human, Viveros de Castro says, the human becomes a wholly other thing. Western anthropocentrism and Amerindian anthropomorphism are not only different then, they imply diametrically opposed stances towards the world and other species. From an integral or integral grammatological perspective, the strong pronounal emphasis in the Amerindian cosmology presented thus far should be apparent, and Viveros de Castro himself is quite explicit about it. But the adverbial and prepositional emphases are notable as well. Multinaturalism, in recognizing a plurality of natures, acknowledges a plurality of qualitatively distinct modes or pathways of being and becoming, distinctly embodied worlds of experience, unique to each kind of entity or form. It is adverbial in its embrace of the qualitative diversity, ontological plurality, and transformative fluidity of being. With the concept that the body is the origin of living perspective, the body not only qualitatively inflects one's mode of being and becoming, it serves as a fluidly relational nexus, a node of and for co-presence in complex webs of interspecific relations and interactions. And with the notion that there is an intensive human-non-human difference internal to each being, this is, in a sense, a version of the prepositional, holographic within, with/in relationship that I've described elsewhere. We can bring more dimensionality to these perspectives with a look at some of the other terms Viveros de Castro introduces. The first, insistence, is one he only briefly mentions and then drops, but I include it here for its complementarity to several of the concepts that will follow. In Amerindian thought, the mythic time, the mythic realm, is a relational space of indistinction, in/distinction, where clear boundaries between forms blur and fail to hold. Viveros de Castro compares this to Deleuze's plane of immanence, and names Insistence as the pre-cosmological, ontologically impenetrable entities that populate this space, as indeterminate schemas or templates for existential unfoldment. In Western thought, categories are often clear-cut, demarcating a world of stark divisions, animate versus inanimate, natural versus supernatural. In the Amerindian cosmological landscape, however, insistents represent entities that challenge these divisions. They embody characteristics that might seem contradictory or in constant flux from the perspective of more categorically fixed versions of Western ontology. For instance, a spirit in Amerindian cosmology might simultaneously exhibit animalistic and human qualities, or a natural phenomenon might possess both material and spiritual significance. This fluidity of insistence is central to the Amerindian understanding of the cosmos. It positions beings within a network of relations, where existence is not linear but intricately interconnected. This nonlinear interconnectedness resonates with the prepositioning pre-structure highlighted in prepositional philosophy. Insistents function as mediators or connectors between different realms or states of being, embodying the interconnectedness central to Amerindian thought. They integrate multiple perspectives within themselves, multiple ways of being, representing a kind of ontological pluralism where different viewpoints coexist and interact. Closely related to this are the concepts of infinite self-difference and intensive superposition. Infinite self-difference stands in stark contrast to the Western fixation on static essences. In the Amerindian cosmological framework, beings are not fixed entities but virtualities, at once indeterminate and filled with potential. Infinite self-difference suggests that a being's identity is inherently and perpetually diverse within itself, always in a state of difference from itself, never fully coinciding with a singular identity. Viveros de Castro is worth quoting at length on this point. What defines the agents and patients of mythic events is their intrinsic capacity to be something else, he says. In this sense, each persona infinitely differs from itself, given that it is initially supposed by mythic discourse only in order to be replaced, which is to say, transformed. Such self-difference is the characteristic property of the notion of spirit, which is why all mythic beings are conceived of as spirits and as shamans, and every finite mode or actual existent reciprocally can manifest as, for it was, a spirit, when its reason to be is recounted in myth. The supposed lack of differentiation between mythic subjects is a function of their being constitutively irreducible to essences or fixed identities, whether generic, specific, or even individual. Myth proposes an ontological regime ordered by a fluent intensive difference bearing on each of the points of a heterogeneous continuum, where transformation is anterior to form, relations superior to terms, and intervals interior to being. As infinite self-difference challenges notions of static or determinate identity, the concept of intensive superposition challenges the linear historical progression of events familiar in Western thought. It implies the simultaneous coexistence of multiple states or forms at a single juncture, aligning metaphorically with quantum superpositions in physics, where particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. In a similar vein, intensive superposition in Amerindian thought allows for a complex layering of realities, where various potentialities and truths coexist and intermingle at a single moment or point. For example, consider a shaman who, during a ritual, embodies both the human and the spirit world. This is not merely a symbolic or metaphorical representation, but a literal coexistence of different states of being. The shaman here becomes a nexus of multiple realities, existing simultaneously as a human, a spiritual conduit, and perhaps even embodying the essence of other entities or spirits. Metamorphosis in this context is not a process, was not yet a process, and will never be a process, Viveros de Castro argues. It is both anterior and external to the process of process. It is a figure, a figuration of becoming. It involves, in other words, a holistic, instantaneous change, again analogous to the discontinuous, instantaneous quantum leap of a subatomic particle. Mythic narratives in Amerindian cosmology depict the transformation of a transparent, pre-cosmological state into the ordered world we know. This transformation involves the sorting of a chaotic, indistinct flux into discernible forms and identities. In this metamorphic process, entities like jaguars and humans are understood to acquire, or better, to disclose, dual aspects, one feline or animalistic and the other human. These aspects alternate between being prominent, figure, and latent, ground. Many myths tell the story of how the initial state of the cosmos, once transparent and infinitely complex, evolved eventually to obscure this enfolded complexity, or to make it less apparent. The spiritual or soulful aspects of beings, both human and animal, then become invisible, while their physical forms become visible and distinct. However, this division between the visible and invisible, the material and spiritual, isn't absolute. It can be reversed or altered, especially during significant rituals aimed at reconnecting with or reactivating this more fundamental underlying reality. These rituals serve as a means to access or bring forth the enduring, unmanifest potential that underlies all existence. The final concept I wanted to explore in this discussion is that of perspectival commutators. Perspectival commutators are shaman-like entities, or particular sacred mechanisms within Amerindian cosmology that mediate and enable shifts between different realities and perspectives. They work in interstitial zones, facilitating points of contact and opening lines of communication that are otherwise impossible under ordinary circumstances. At the heart of Amerindian perspectivism is the understanding that the visible form of each species is merely an envelope or a clothing that conceals an internal human form. This internal form is not accessible to all, but can be perceived by members of the same species or by special beings capable of perspective shifting, such as shamans. In the eyes of a jaguar, for instance, other jaguars are seen in their human form, a perspective typically inaccessible to humans without the mediation of a perspectival commutator. To be a perspectival commutator is a prepositional occupation, to be sure. Even more, it's a metaximodal one. The species and even existentially androgynous shaman positions her or himself relationally between the invisible and visible, the living and dead, the mythic and actual, and in the actual, interspecifically, between the many perspectively embodied modes of becoming. The shaman, in his or her being, embodies and collectively enacts the deeply prepositional and adverbial intuitions of Amerindian culture. For what is infinite self-difference and intensive superposition but a prepositional model of selfhood, where we are both always next to and beyond ourselves? Or but an adverbial one, where in mythic time we are always already adverbially inflected by what is otherwise than being? A prepositional register also stands out sharply in Viveros de Castro's description of the blood/beer conjunction of human and jaguar perception. Quoting him, "Multinaturalism does not suppose a thing in itself partially apprehended through categories of understanding common to each species. We should not think that Indians imagine that there exists a something equal X, something that humans, for instance, would see as blood and jaguars as beer. What exists in multinature are not such self-identical entities differently perceived, but immediately relational multiplicities of the type blood/beer. There exists, if you will, only the limit between blood and beer, the border by which these two affinal substances communicate and diverge. Finally, there is no X that would be blood to one species and beer to another. There is just blood/beer, that from the very start is one of the characteristic singularities or affections of the human/jaguar." Here we find the mythic prefiguring of Catherine Keller's prepositional connective differences, the chora in Edward Berge's hierarchical complexity, or the separative connector in Layman's metaphysics of adjacency. For me, the virgule between blood and beer is the infinite intersection at the heart of the wild knot, which we, each of us, are. A third framing concept that Viveros de Castro offers in his ontological turn is cannibal alterity. In his fieldwork with the Arawete people, he struggled to understand the operative logic in cannibalistic practices. There didn't seem to be much testimonial evidence he could collect that the people practicing it imagined they were either propitiating some deity or taking the enemy's powers into themselves. Instead, noting how in their songs they would toggle perspectives between the celebrant and the one being consumed, he found it seemed to be much more a case of perspectival transmutation, where the I of the celebrant is determined as other through the act of incorporating the other. The flesh that is actually eaten in such a ceremony is tiny, insignificant after all. What is consumed rather is the other's positionality, as enemy, as other, and through that, one's own hidden alterity is disclosed. In all of this discussion, then, and in noting both the differences and affinities between Amerindian and modern or post-postmodern worldviews, I'm not suggesting that Amerindian cosmology is something that we can or should take up as our own. It's not being offered here as an alternative for contemporary culture. Rather, my hope is that, in taking these perspectives, in engaging in and enjoying this feast, we might come to both a clearer and altered perception of ourselves and our visionary projects. In positioning Metaximodality, both as the sensibility of a, for us, lost and mythic past, and the possible attractor of an uncertain time to come, I am hoping to invite us shamanically into a practice of perspectival commutation. Philosophically, we've been intuitively feeling our way back to more participatory, open-ended, relationally centered modes of being in the world for some time now, and Amerindian cosmology presents us with what I feel is a powerful image of that, what I would consider to be a uniquely metaximodal version of that. But in this time of rapidly evolving AI, climate crisis, intercultural collision, and impending global transformation, with old sureties crumbling and the cloud of the impossible looming on the horizon, what an integral return, beyond our pronounal quadrants, to deep adverbial and prepositional engagement with reality will entail? Well, we'll begin to explore that in this series, but what it will fully look like? That myth yet awaits.